As the situation in the Middle East grows more fractured, there are new questions about the effectiveness of the United States counterterrorism policy in Yemen. Jeremy Scahill is a national security correspondent for The Nation and author of this week's cover story on Yemen. Jeremy, it's a great piece. I wanted to just discuss a couple excerpts from the story, which I thought were pretty compelling. You quote a Yemeni journalist on al-Qaeda saying, Yemeni tribesmen, he says, share one common goal with al-Qaeda, which is revenge against the Americans, because those who were killed are the sons of the tribesmen, and the tribesmen never, ever give up on revenge.
Right. Well, you know, President Obama began bombing Yemen in December of 2009, and in the first strike that he authorized, cruise missiles and cluster bombs, which are these horrifying flying landmines that just shred people into meat, was an erroneous bomb, and it actually hit a village full of very, very poor Bedouins and killed over 40 of them. And the Yemeni government tried to cover it up and say that it was Yemeni forces that did it, but we know from the WikiLeaks cables that in fact it was U.S. forces. And we actually went there and filmed the missile parts and saw they were made by General Dynamic. They said made in the United States on them. That incident and others have caused a situation where al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is a group of maybe 700 people, it does not represent an existential threat to the United States. Right. They want to represent an existential threat to the United States, but they're limited to things like the failed underwear bomber, the guy who just got life in prison this week. But the fact is that these tribes that didn't necessarily have any affinity for al-Qaeda are now starting to say, well, we share an agenda with them. And the U.S. counterterrorism policy is incredibly unpopular. The U.S. backed this corrupt, ruthless dictator, Ali Abdullah Saleh. In fact, he's not far from here right now. He's at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel under protection of the United States. But the fact is that our counterterrorism policy in Yemen is backfiring in an extraordinary way and is actually fulfilling the prophecy of some of these al-Qaeda guys who said Yemen is going to be the next Afghanistan or Iraq or Pakistan. And that's what I heard from people of all political stripes in Yemen. Why is the U.S. bombing? And when they bomb, why do they seem to be hitting civilians so often?
Well, the drone strikes are one thing, but also our funding of the Saleh sort of counterterrorism movement and forces over there seems to really be biting on. I mean, it's counterintuitive at the end of the day. Because
why do they hit civilians? Did you get an answer to that question?
Well, you know, I think this cuts to the heart, and I've seen this in Somalia, where I was a few months ago. I've seen it in Afghanistan. It's happening regularly in Pakistan. The U.S. intelligence relies oftentimes on very flimsy human intel on the ground. Yeah. My understanding from people in the intelligence community, and some people in the intelligence community are very disturbed about the number of civilians that get killed because it causes blowback. You need 3 human intelligence reports to put someone on a kill list. So if you have some people that have tribal grudges against someone else, they can sort of do death by Americans. It happens all the time in Afghanistan. 3 people on 3 days, the Americans, these Taliban in this house. Next guy comes and he says, there's a Taliban. And then and he says, well, they're a suicide bomber. And Joint Special Operations Command, Navy SEALs burst into a home, end up shooting a bunch of people. And, it actually turned out that was a U.S.-trained Afghan police commander. And I mean, that's a real story that I documented when I was in Afghanistan. In Yemen, it's the same thing. It could be that the Saleh regime also fed bad intelligence to the Americans to try to kill political opponents. There was a deputy governor of a province in Yemen who was killed in one of the U.S. airstrikes, and U.S. intelligence officials now believe that it was because the Saleh regime wanted him killed that they fed them bad intelligence. So we have a total dearth of intelligence on the ground in Yemen. We are the most clueless people operating in Yemen. The Saudis are infinitely more informed and powerful than us, and Saleh has played us like a master chess player.
Well, and there's a financial incentive in the Saleh government to keep receiving, obviously, U.S. counterterrorism.
It's his cash cow. It's his crack cocaine. I mean, and he realized, Saleh is such a clever dictator, he realized that if you come to America after 9/11 and say to Bush, we're with you and not the terrorists, that was all it took for the cowboy presidency of Bush to be like, yeah, well, we'll support you. He then takes our money, builds up these counterterrorism units, and then even John Brennan, the chief counterterrorism advisor of the president, admits Saleh's counterterrorism forces aren't fighting terrorism. They are being used for the defense of the regime in the face of a popular uprising.
And this is the question of who our partners are in the region, right? And we look at foreign policy is not something we have discussed of late. The most we discuss it is sort of rebuffing or discussing Republicans' accusation that Obama has been an appeaser. But if you look at 2012, one of the great question marks over Obama's re-election effort is what's going to happen in terms of foreign policy, not just in Yemen, of course, but in Syria, and then certainly with Iran and Israel.
And defense has really fallen off in terms of what people are concerned about, defense or war, in terms of what they're concerned about when they vote. But Jeremy, what's the answer? answer? Do we increase the budget for the CIA to make sure we have our own people on the ground?
Well, I mean, there's one school of thought, and people are sort of saying counterinsurgency is dead, that the Coinistas sort of lost in Afghanistan, and that the U.S. War there was a failure, and in one way or another, the Taliban are going to have to be included in a political solution. I mean, I think we have to stop being afraid of Islamist movements in the region. I just talked with the former head of the CIA's political Islam division, and he was saying that the United States has become so terrified of the word Islam that we're failing to understand the actual allies we would have in these countries. I think what we need to learn is that if we're setting out to try to defeat terrorism, what we're doing by doing these not targeted strikes, because they're not targeted strikes, is creating the very threat we say that we're trying to address or to stamp out. What's interesting, Alex, is that this Washington Post ABC poll showed that 83% of Americans actually support the president's drone policy.
Right.
I would be very curious to see if there was a President McCain in office right now instead of a President Obama, if that would be true. Because liberal Democrats now are supporting targeted assassinations even of U.S. citizens
and we talked
without
about this
trial.
during the break. I think we don't know what the collateral. There's no broad sense amongst the American public what the collateral damage of these drone strikes is. I mean, we hear sort of anecdotal reports. They're fairly piecemeal, and I think on a lot of levels it makes liberal Democrats feel good that they can support some sort of,
Jeremy's right. I mean, President Obama has gotten a huge pass from people who were devout civil libertarians during the Bush administration because primarily he's a Democrat, and it's one of those things that we see people like Glenn Greenwald talk about all the time, but it is sort of intellectually dishonest of these people to not hold the president to the same accountability that they held Bush.
And it also is apparently not great counterterrorism strategy either. Right. Jeremy Scahill, thank you so much for joining us. A great read, the cover of The Nation this week. Coming up, the Linspiration.